We're going to art school today on Locked on Wild as we paint up some new line combinations like Bob Ross painting trees on the side of a mountain.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Sports Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. And just as a reminder, you can find Locked on Wild on all of your favorite podcast platforms, absolutely free of charge. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we fix, as much as we can, the Wild's offensive line combinations. We'll also talk about some suggestions for improvement on defense as the Wilds gear up to play the New Jersey Devils tomorrow. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and after another bad loss to the Vegas Golden Knights, it was interesting to see the comments after by head coach Dean Evason and by some of the players as well. It's pretty easy to tell that whatever is going on with this team has a lot of people just bewildered as to how the team has sunk as far as they have. Players are taking frustration out. Marc-Andre Fleury breaking his stick after the fifth goal allowed in the game against the Golden Knights. Everybody's frustrated. And it has, I think, boiled over to everybody, whether it be the players on the ice, the fans watching, those covering the team. It's just not a particularly fun brand of hockey to cover at this point in time. Struggles offensively are widespread and have just created a nightmare scenario for either Marc-Andre Fleury or Filip Gustavsson, having to feel like they can't give up a goal every time they are out there. Because if you give up more than one goal, you're likely going to be saddled with a loss at this point. And we talked about it with Kevin Gorg after the game. And part of the reason that this episode is coming out so late was just waiting to see if anything happens today. Because you just get the sense more and more as this goes along that Bill Guerin has the detonator and is just waiting to push the button to make some level of changes to try to get this team back on track. And with what we're going to do today, I want to take a couple of things into consideration just right before we even start with trying to plug these lines together, because I'm going to put line combinations together with reasoning while also discussing the alternatives for what else could happen with particular players grouped together. It sounds as though, from what Bill Guerin has said in the last couple of days, is that there really is not going to be any rush to bring Marco Rossi back up to the NHL level. Whether that is something you agree with, disagree, it just doesn't sound like something that's going to happen. And so the Wild are content with the situation deteriorating at the NHL level. They're content with just letting Rossi continue to focus on his game down at the AHL level without having to shoulder the load of trying to save this team this season. Whether or not it's the right call, whether or not you agree with it, that just seems like that's how that's going to play out. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are not going to be players that could be called up to help fill things out. And it just so happens that the Wild have a free roster spot ahead of the game against the Devils at home. A short trip for a player or players to make to be at the XL Energy Center in time to help this team out. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through the process here. But yeah, just some very dejected Dean Evason, his comments just continuing to reiterate that this is not last year's team, that they're not able to do the things that they were last year, and that it's not necessarily effort or fight from this group that is letting everybody down. It's structural and schematic issues that need to be fixed. And so, there's only so much that Dean is able to say. And it was interesting too to hear him talk about how they have addressed this with the team, in that there have been moments of frustration where it was necessary, but they really haven't used the, like, we're going to absolutely lay into you and rip into guys to get this fixed approach. I don't know that screaming in a guy's face that he needs to play better, I don't know that really helps at this point. And so it was interesting to hear that approach has by and large not been used as the team tries to fix it. But I will just again say, as has been a part of the message that we have tried to get across as this skid continues, is that you can only go so far saying it's on the players to improve. You go through enough of a season, and at some point you just are what you are. So it's all well and good saying we are going to give these guys the opportunity to improve and to not do the things they've been doing all season. But at some point you run out of ground and the front wheels of the car end up off the cliff, with the car teetering on falling back onto solid ground or just plunging off into the ravine. And I think we're at the point now where that is really, there are only two scenarios in which this is going to play out. Is either this team is going to get things on track enough to fight for a playoff spot, or they are going to just continue to spiral here as the season plays out. But it's interesting too, in listening to and seeing some of the comments on Twitter from Michael Russo and also from Joe Smith. Joe Smith going so far as to say it just doesn't feel like this team is one addition at the deadline away from getting this all figured out. And I could not agree more. This problem with this roster is one that is just at every level. And so the fixes for it are going to take more time. And it's something that you are going to have to free up several roster spots in order to fix both this season and beyond. So it's a deep-seated problem. The walls and the foundation are starting to crack. And so you can either patch it and just hope that it doesn't get worse, or you roll your sleeves up, get your hands dirty, and make sure that the foundation is solidly fixed before you continue. And so keep that in mind as we navigate through what I'm going to suggest for new line combos for Saturday's game. I will give reasoning as to why I went the particular routes that I did. And so we'll talk about my new look lines for the Wild against the Devils as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by the new exclusive sports betting partner for Locked On, the number one sports book in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. You can download FanDuel now to bet on Super Bowl 57 with a no-sweat first bet. You'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel lets you bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to who will score a touchdown, all leading up to the big game on Sunday. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Best of all, you can get paid your winnings instantly. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, thanks for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For your second listen, make sure you check out the Locked On NHL podcast to get the full lowdown on everything going on in the NHL as we move throughout the season, and more importantly, as we get closer to the trade deadline. Locked On NHL is available on all of your favorite podcast platforms. If it were up to me, here's what I would do for line combinations for the game against the Devils. Kirill Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek, Mats Zuccarello. And here's why. The Wilds are in a position where it's pretty easy to point out the players that are playing most efficiently. And in Joel Eriksson Ek's case, the players that are working the hardest on a night in and night out basis. There are a couple of different ways that you can take what would be effective in between Kirill Kaprizov and Mats Zuccarello. We mentioned when Ryan Hartman was moved back up to that spot that you need somebody that is willing to shoot the puck, something that Sam Steele just was not doing. And I'm going to go off the path a little bit here because I want to point out, courtesy of Brett Marshall, who is frequently mentioned on this show for some of the analytical work that he's able to do on Twitter, one of the hosts of the Sound the Foghorn podcast. Listen to these Sam Steele splits. Sit down first. Make sure you're sitting down before you listen to these. Sam Steele's splits from when he became the number one center to the start of his recent skid, and from the start of the skid until now. In the 24 games that Steele was effective as a 1C for the Wild, he had 45 total shots in 24 games, had 6 goals in that span, 12 assists, had a 58% shot attempt share, and a 56.2% expected goal share. So he was a productive portion of that line for 24 games. But the 11 games since, a 48.2% shot attempt share, a 48.4% expected goal share. He has 1 goal, he has 1 assist, but more importantly, in those 11 games, he has 13 total shots. I applaud, applaud's not the right word. I was fine with the Sam Steele acquisition before the season started because it was a low-risk move, not any salary tied on to it beyond this season. But over those 11 games, and in particular the last 9 or 10 of that span, Sam Steele has been borderline unplayable. And that continued when being put on the line with Matt Boldy and Freddie Gaudreau. Just did not do really anything to assist that team in scoring, and he just has become kind of one of those passenger guys that so many on this team are. And so I move back to why Joel Eriksson Ek should be on the top line is because he's going to bust his tail every night out there. And more importantly, if you have a guy that is, if you're not going to go the route of somebody that's a shooter, somebody who excels at getting to the net and putting themselves in front of the net and being a big body in front of the net. Because what is one of the other things that this team has struggled with so mightily during this stretch is that shots have come from the perimeter of the zone almost exclusively, and it leads to easy saves for the goalie. That's one of the things that Joel Eriksson Ek does so well on the power play, is getting to the net, is using his body to make it a pain to be a goalie with him in front of you. So I want to see Joel Eriksson Ek rewarded for his play this season. Is it a long-term fit for this team to have him as the 1C? Probably not. But at this current moment, Joel Eriksson Ek, of the centers that you have on the roster, is the one that is playing the best. There's no other way to put that. And so if we're going to see the grief line continue to do what they've done the last couple of games, which has been just be on the wrong end of every goal that is scored on this team, then maybe that is a big enough move to shake some life back into this team by splitting the grief line up. And if you're going to do that, Joel Eriksson Ek to the top line. So for those keeping track at home, Kirill Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek, and Matt Zuccarello. That's your top line. Your second line is going to involve Sammy Walker being called up from Iowa, because you do have the open roster spot that is not being utilized currently by this team. Call him up, move Freddie Gaudreau back to center. And yes, I know Gaudreau has struggled over the last couple of games as well, but season as a whole, Gaudreau has been the least chaos outcome of the centers. Eriksson Ek has been consistently good. Gaudreau has been consistent. And I'm not slighting Connor Dewar here. We're gonna get to Dewar, because there's going to be an elevation for those guys in this process as well. Gaudreau has just been consistent for this team. He maybe doesn't give you a ton of offensive upside. He just has been consistent, with the exception of these last couple of games. So Boldy, Gaudreau, and Walker, that line looked great when those guys were paired together earlier in the season when Walker was called up with all the injuries. So go back to that as just a baseline point. Go back to that three and let them see if they can rekindle that magic and see what you can get with those two lines for scoring. The new grief line comes with a caveat. Brandon Duhaime, Connor Dewar, and Marcus Foligno. Foligno has looked old the last couple of games. I don't know if he's hurt or if it's just starting to kind of catch up with him a little bit, but he has definitely not had the same step as in previous seasons. And so I'm willing to give that a shot, because I think of the elements, you've got Connor Dewar, who is great defensively. He can replicate the Joel Eriksson Ek presence on that line. Brandon Duhaime can replace everything that Jordan Greenway brought to the table. And so I go with that as your defensive line that you throw out there. And absolutely do Connor Dewar and Brandon Duhaime deserve more minutes. We've talked about it several times on this show this season. Those guys, they are high motor guys. They play hard. They do everything that's asked of them. Connor Dewar is one of the best, if not the best, maybe besides Jonas Brodin, penalty killers on this team. And so it's about time that they get rewarded for what they have done on the ice. And in particular, in Duhaime's case, the reduction in penalties that he's taken that we have seen spike in guys like Ryan Hartman, and just, again, just looking like you give a hoot about what's going on out on the ice. That speaks volumes. And it seems like on a nightly basis on the broadcast, it's pointed out that the fourth line is giving you some good minutes, a good shift by the fourth line in the offensive zone. So let's reward those guys for it. So Duhaime, Dewar, and Foligno. But if we see more of this trend from Foligno, then I'm going to put Mason Shaw in that spot and just let those guys do their thing. Just put that combo together, let them do their thing, and stop penalizing them for what the top three lines in front of them are not doing. Dewar, Duhaime, they're not turning the puck over. They're not taking stupid penalties. Let's give those guys a little bit of a reward for not being part of the problem this season so far. And then your fourth line is what I'm calling at this point the castaways. The guys who have fallen out of favor this year or are so penalty prone that if you're going to have a line that does not see requisite time on the ice, it's those guys. And it's a combination of Ryan Hartman, Jordan Greenway, Ryan Reeves, and Sam Steele. And you just, whatever guys are giving you any signs of life from that grouping are the ones that play on any given night. But I also have put those guys into a category of players that are likely to be moved off the roster or will be allowed to walk via free agency in Sam Steele's case, if he's even on the roster by the time the season is over. If this stretch for him continues, he probably won't be. So those are your line combinations: Kaprizov, Eriksson Ek, Zuccarello, Boldy, Goudreau, Walker, Duhaime, Dewar, Foligno, and some combination of Greenway, Hartman, and Steele, Shaw, and Reeves. And honestly, if we're picking for who deserves to be now that the other roster spot has been filled, press box goes to Sam Steele and to Ryan Reeves. So your fourth line then for Saturday would be Ryan Hartman at center, Jordan Greenway on the wing, and Mason Shaw on the other side. That's the combo I'm going with at this point. I think it sends a message to the guys that need to have the message sent, but it also rewards the guys who have not been, by and large, part of the problem here this season. I, of course, want to hear from everybody else. So leave a comment on YouTube, leave a post on Twitter, tweet at Locked On Wild. Let me know what you would do with line combinations for the game against the Devils and even beyond. And I want to see kind of where everybody else's heads are at, because this is what I see. It's not the right answer. There may not be a right answer. And so just let's get this discussion going so that we can try to figure out what the heck to do with these line combinations to try to get this thing back on track. Now, that's on the offensive side. Defensively, we're going to talk through that as well as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, thanks for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For your second listen, make sure you check out the Locked On NHL Prospects show to get the full lowdown on the biggest names that will be available in the 2023 NHL Draft, plus a look at each organization's best prospects as well. Locked On NHL Prospects is available on all of your favorite podcast platforms, absolutely free of charge. Now, looking at the defense, it's not as easy at this current moment. Let's just assume that Jonas Brodin finds his way back into the lineup. So you've got your requisites, you've got your stable of defensemen at this point that will be available for the game. You get a problem, though, because if Brodin doesn't play, you have really one good defensive pairing in Jared Spurgeon and Jake Middleton. Dumba and Goligoski has not been good over the last few games, especially with Brodin out of the lineup. But the other problem is that Merrill and Addison is taking on water as well. And so I don't know if Brodin doesn't play. I don't know what you do to flip unless you go Goligoski, Addison, and then go Merrill, Dumba. But those are pretty much the same interchangeable pieces. You've got Kalen Addison, who is an offensive defenseman, at least offers you something offensively, but he still has work to do defensively to become, a well-rounded defenseman in the NHL. He is probably better than Matt Dumba on defense, definitely better on offense. And so, maybe just because he's younger, he still has a lot of the energy, a lot of the ability to still maneuver on the ice. Maybe that would be better with Goligoski, but I wonder if there is really no good way to do it. Because let's say you decide, well, we're going to use two primary D pairings and go Spurgeon, Middleton, and then we'll go Merrill, Goligoski as your second pairing. Then you're asking a lot for those two guys, and then you've got a pair of defensemen in Dumba and Addison that is not really able to play much defense at all. So you're in a dicey situation defensively regardless. And even if Jonas Brodin does play, I think in that case, of the two, I think you got to sit Matt Dumba. I think we have gotten to the point that Matt Dumba is not playable. With all the problems going on with his D-core, I don't think he gives you really much of anything. At least with Alex Goligoski, yes, he's getting up there in age. He at least has an acumen as a defensive defenseman. So he at least has something to kind of draw back from. And furthermore, the issues on defense are more than just the personnel. It's these just hideous pinches that the team is trying to prevent odd man rushes the other way. They don't work. And guess what? They lead to odd man rushes anyway. And so this tendency by the D-core to try to pinch guys from getting into the zone as freely as they do, it doesn't work. You put yourself in a bad position. And so not only, I think, defensively, do you have to really make some tough choices, but you just have to stop getting lazy, frankly. It just comes down to trying to cut a corner. And so this is, I think, indicative of a real overarching problem. Michael Russo tweeted about it last night. It's a team that has shown just this real undisciplined side this season, and they don't have the offense to overlook it. And part of the other problem too is that we're not just talking about going from like the third ranked 5-on-5 scoring offense in the NHL to like 15th, where, yeah, you're not going to be elite, but you're at least league average. No, they have plummeted all the way down to 28th. And so that has just compounded all of these problems all season. But you have the undisciplined penalties and you have all the other turnovers, these defensive pinches. And so while the offense shriveling up has been an alarming issue this year. I think the undisciplined play is every bit as startling and alarming this season as the offense drying up is. Because you would think that a team that is not able to score as many goals as they did last year, you'd think they would along the way just learn, hey, we've got to really tighten up. We have to work harder. We have to be smarter. We have to stop committing penalties because anytime we do and it leads to a goal for the opponent, it's going to be that much harder for us to overcome that. And instead of collectively just playing a smarter brand of hockey, it's gone fully the other way. And so it has both of those have compounded into just a mess for this team for most of the season. And so, the warts still exist. These line combinations are just in an attempt to jolt the team. And maybe if you have some key guys that are playing substantially less minutes than they're used to, maybe that'll be enough to kind of wake everybody up and get them back on track. But it still stems from, I will believe it when I see it in terms of the line combinations and the changes, because that's the one thing that Dean Evason has shown in his tenure as Wild head coach, is that unless absolutely necessary, he really doesn't tinker. And so this is what I would do, but I have a feeling I know what we'll see against the Devils come Saturday. That will do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. So now that your first listen of the day is done, make sure you check out the Locked On NHL podcast to get the full lowdown on everything going on throughout the wide world of the NHL. All free and available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just like Locked On Wild, so make sure in order to stay as up-to-date as possible on the Minnesota Wild that you follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on YouTube as well as on social media as well so that you can stay up-to-date on your favorite team here in the state of hockey. We've got new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Sports Podcast Network.